Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I have to say, what a fantastic conference this has been. I don't know if this is is this a normal security conference to Europe? Are they all like this? Or is this one great? I feel like it's really good, so thanks very much for having me. I'm going to tell you a little story today. I'm going to take a bit of a different tack. I'm not going to talk about AI, because we're not there yet. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the incidents that we've had in Australia, and I'm going to start the way all good stories start, long, long ago, in a country far away. Who remembers 1988? Come on, some of you. Let's see. 1988? Who wasn't born in 1988? Okay, fair. All right, so in 1988 in Australia, we released the Privacy Act, and for its time, it was pretty exciting and forward-thinking. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of context here. We've had a couple of updates to the Privacy Act, most recently in 2014. How many years ago is that? Everyone yell out the answer. It's a while back, right? So recently, we've had a few incidents in Australia. Now, who's heard about those? Who's heard about the recent cybersecurity incidents in Australia? All right, I'll take you back a little bit, and you can all Google. I'm not going to mention the names of any companies because I try not to talk about our clients, but you can all Google them and find out who they are if you're really curious. So I'm going to set a little bit of context first. And first of all, in Australia, up until recently, and through the COVID period, we had what we call a Liberal government, so a right-side government, and perhaps they did some interesting things. So, England had Boris Johnson, America had Trump, and we had Scott Morrison, or ScoMo, as we used to call him, and it wasn't really a great nickname. So during the COVID period, ScoMo spent a whole lot of time swearing himself in as the other minister for almost every portfolio except for cybersecurity. So he didn't have a cybersecurity minister. And then in the middle of last year, thankfully, we got a chance to vote him out, and we had a new Labor government. And they did something that really a government in Australia had not done before, and that was to appoint a cybersecurity minister to Cabinet. So our Minister for Home Affairs, Claire O'Neill, who we're very fond of, also holds the cybersecurity portfolio. Although, to be honest, she talks so much about cybersecurity, I'm hoping she's getting enough time to do Home Affairs. So that's a great development in Australia for us. We're getting a lot more focus. But it's been interesting in the last little while. So let me just talk you through the timeline here. And you've got to remember, Australia is a country of about 25 million people. So take the kids away, maybe you've got 18 or 19 million people. On September 20th, an incident occurred to one of our major telcos. Now, as part of the regulatory framework after September 11th, the telcos were required to collect data from all of the individual citizens that they have an account with. So if you start a new phone account or you get a new mobile account, you need to provide what we call 100 points of ID, and that almost always includes at least your driver's licence and your passport, maybe your birth certificate and a utility bill. So there's a lot of personal information that's collected during that process. And the new government regulations required it to be held for 7 years. So you can imagine the sort of data that's starting to build up in telco networks. And on September 20th, the CEO of one of our major telcos, whose parent company is actually in Singapore, so not owned within Australia, got a phone call to say, hey, you're about to get on a plane for 15 hours back from the US. Maybe don't get on that plane. And arguably that was because it's a Qantas plane and there wasn't any Wi-Fi on the plane. So that aside, they sort of said, we can't afford to have you out of communications for the next 15 hours. We think we've been hacked. So that started there, and I'm just going to take a little break there to go back to a second piece of regulation that we put in place reasonably late in the piece as well. But late last year, and Australia has been a bit of a regulatory-free environment. And I'll remind you as well that Australia, as well as being a long way away, is a long way from anywhere. So to get really anywhere except New Zealand in Australia, you need to get on a flight for about 7 hours, okay? And the last time we were physically attacked in Australia, like as in there was a risk of someone actually coming to do something to us, was in World War II, and there was one air raid on Darwin, which is right in the north, and lots of people in Australia have never been to Darwin. So it's been a long time since anyone's come to do anything dicey to us in Australia, and we're pretty relaxed as a nation as a result. So in this context, last year we released the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which was really designed around protecting our critical infrastructure and putting some rules in place to make sure that anybody who owned critical infrastructure, whether that was government-owned or privately owned, started looking at protecting it a little bit better. So as part of that act, amazingly and incredibly to us in the cybersecurity industry in Australia, our Signals Directorate sort of reserved the right to come into a private corporation and do whatever was required to get the attack under control. And we all thought, in our complacent way in Australia, the Signals Directorate's never going to come to a private organisation and jump into their network and do things to it. We don't need to worry about that. So let's just have that context and then cue the attack that we had on this telco. So they get the call on September 20th. They had a regulatory requirement under critical infrastructure to report that within 72 hours. The CEO actually did all the right things, and she is a she, so it's quite interesting actually that we have a female cyber minister, we had a female CEO in the first kind of major data breach. So let me just clarify what had happened. In the end, there was something like 16 million records released. Now, I went through the numbers before about how many people live in Australia, so you can all do the math. Almost everybody in Australia had their core identifiers, personal data, captured in this release. And it's one of the most interesting, attacks we've seen just because of the sheer scale of the attack. And also because of the political context. So we've got this new cyber minister, we've got a sheer scale attack that we hadn't seen the like of. In fact, we were talking about it, read the panel yesterday, and one of the guys said, it's like the whole country was breached. And that really describes, exactly what had happened. So almost every Australian adult was affected by this data breach. It created a lot of consternation, and we've got this new cyber minister looking to make some waves. So it was reported on the 22nd of September, ahead of the curve, ahead of where they needed to report it. And the CEO decided very sensibly that she personally needed to front it. So she got in front of the media. At some point, she must have taken that 15-hour flight back. Maybe they picked one that definitely had Wi-Fi that time. Not all flights to Australia do. I make it sound like a real backwater. We are actually a first world country, so just to clarify. She got on that flight and then she got in front of the media pretty quickly, within 2 days, and said, we've had this breach. This is what's happened. These are the records that have been stolen. This is what we know. She was and still remains under a federal police order not to give any details or speak about the attack in any level of detail, and Mandiant was called in to start doing the forensic analysis. There was a huge war room, as you might imagine, of hundreds of people pulled off whatever their day jobs were, trying to work out what had happened. And she actually compared it as an exercise to basically having a broken window in a warehouse, some muddy footprints, and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of stock in the warehouse, and then she's got to get everyone in to do a detailed inventory to work out what had been taken, right? So that the mechanism of how they got in became largely unimportant, and we can have a conversation offline about the value of attribution, and I think in this case it probably wasn't the first way to go. Unbelievably, what happened then was the hackers reached out to a journalist and said, the way that we got in was through an open API that was left open to the internet. Now, somewhat incredibly, this journalist released this information, which was interesting, and everybody believed them. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if hackers say that they've done X or Y, what would you rate that in terms of how accurate that might be? Hackers say they do a lot of things, right? Whether you take them at face value. Anyway, that created this huge political storm. People were like angry at this telco. How could you have let this happen? You left the window open. No one broke the window. And it's a great analogy because the reality is, whether they walked in the window or broke the window or not, it's hardly the most important issue in the problem. But it obviously put the telco CEO under an enormous amount of pressure. She famously ended up in tears as part of this press conference because the journalists were being so aggressive. And also famously on television during an appearance, the minister suggested that it wasn't a complex, advanced, sophisticated hack at all, and that in fact they'd been let in. Now this was on the basis, I'll remind you, of what the hackers had said to a journalist. And were they actually the hackers or were they a third party? So we doubled down from a federal government perspective. We sent the resources and help that they needed, which was really useful and well received. By this time, there's hundreds of people working on this, third-party companies. I listened with shock, as I'm sure you all did, to the conversation about Ukraine yesterday. And it is amazing, whilst it's nothing like the same situation, how a crisis gets everybody in the room to solve a cybersecurity problem. But up until then, we don't seem to be able to get together regardless of where you are. Certainly, though, this did make a big difference, and there was lots of support. And we actually started to work through the problem and understand the issue. And just while we were getting there, while people were talking about it, there were a lot of government agencies offering to replace ID, so you could go and get a free passport or a free new driver's licence. Obviously, a bit of a difficult problem to solve, and there was a question of, do you bother going to get a new passport or a driver's licence? The optics and the effort, we have an offensive cyber team in our signals directorate, they got involved, and the hacker came online. They'd released about 10,000 records and said, actually we've changed our minds. Don't worry about paying the ransom. We're not doing this anymore. It's getting too hot in the kitchen, which was a really interesting development because I certainly haven't heard about the hackers giving up on a ransom because it was getting a bit hot in the kitchen before. Anyway, a very interesting development. They obviously felt that it was getting too close or that they might be caught or have other problems. So that was great. And just as that happened, we had a second major breach on October the 13th, where obviously both the government and the private sector had learned a lot and had made some different decisions. So the minister and the government were much more conciliatory in their dealings with it. This was a big medical insurer, and it was actually a really nasty hack. So a stack of data records were stolen in relation to people's medical records. And in subsequent days, first of all, they called for this insurer to, for people to sell the shares they had in this insurer. So they were absolutely trying to affect the stock price and engagement with that company, affect their market share. They did put out a ransom demand. It wasn't particularly high, $1 million. The government worked with this insurer and sent those teams in that I told you about again. Whether you necessarily want that to happen, certainly Singtel, the parent company of the telco, wasn't super happy about the signals directorate being in the network having a look at things. This insurer is Australian-based, so it was a bit of a different story. They gratefully accepted the help. The way that this was done in terms of presenting it to the press was very, very different. So, the CEO in the telco had gotten out in front really early on, straight away, fronted it herself, etc. Been really clear about what they did and didn't know. In the medical insurer, they initially said, no customer data has been breached. And then they were like, actually, maybe some customer data has been breached. Actually, a lot of customer data has been breached. So in the end, it was 9.7 million records, so nearly as much. So by this time, everyone in Australia has been compromised in terms of their personal data, right? And no one's really asking the question of why we're using core identifiers and don't have a digital identity system, which is probably a relevant question to ask. However, moving back, we didn't really hear from the CEO. If we did, it certainly wasn't in a press conference, it wasn't early, it wasn't up front, and I won't comment on whether there's a gendered thing there. The female CEO did an outstanding job of fronting it herself and taking accountability and making sure they got out front as early as they could. The other thing that they needed to do was adjust some of the legislation because it was actually not legal for the telco or the medical insurer to tell banks or other institutions who had been compromised and that they were therefore at risk. So there were some changes, obviously, that needed to be made to the legislation, which were a bit of a problem. And during this medical insurer, shall we say, debacle, they then started, the hacker then started releasing really nasty details, actually, about whether people had had abortions or, medical procedures. So it was really uncomfortable and awkward. The government asked them not to pay the ransom, and so they very publicly didn't. But it was a very different experience, and with the benefit of hindsight, a lot of people looked back to the telco and sort of said, actually, maybe that breach was handled pretty well. What we found out in the medical insurance breach is that, in fact, there were no penalties or very few penalties under the Privacy Act. So I think there was a fine of less than $1 million. So it's now been adjusted. But what I wanted to really talk about and make the point of is that the lack of legislation and complacency in Australia has really led us to a place where we didn't have a good story for either of these. And certainly it's really turned the heat up in terms of CEOs really looking into what they're doing. And I'm now going to invite my fellow panellists on to have a bit of a chat, because we're going to talk about the impact of legislation and regulation.